So thank you everyone for joining today's Retrofit Talks webinar. I'm delighted that you could make this session for lunchtime today on the 21st of May. We'll be hearing from Lucas Barry of Carmody Groarke, an architect's practice who specialises in adaptive reuse. And alongside Lucas, we've got Quinton Clark joining us from the client side from the Unity Group. And they will be sharing insights and learnings from the Bethnal Green Road project. That's 469 Bethnal Green Road, which was a 1970s textile warehouse and is now being converted to office use. So looking forward to welcoming Lucas and Quinton in a moment. But just before we get started, a bit of context for today and today's Retrofit Talk. This is part of the Building Centre's Retrofit 24 season. I'm Laura Broderick, and I've been working on the programme, The Exhibition, here in the centre, which if you haven't visited, you're more than welcome to pop down Mondays to Fridays to see the show. And also a whole series of events that we've got planned, from panel discussions through to webinars and also some building tours. So do check out our buildingcentre.co.uk website to find out what else you can book on, and hopefully we'll see you at some future events. So just the format of today's webinar, we'll be passing over to Lucas and Quinton in a moment, and they will share a presentation, talk you through the process for the building project and some of the decisions made on that retrofit adaptive reuse process. And then we'll have some time for Q&A with you, our audience. In order to facilitate that, there is a text box function, the Q&A box, through the webinar. We can't hear you on this webinar, so you will have to type your questions into that, and I will address those to our speakers at the end of their presentation. But if you do have thoughts in mind, jot them down either in the text box as we go, or keep them in mind for when I open up the questions formally. We'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure Lucas and Quinton would love to answer your questions. And we'll be finished by 1:45. So that's the format of today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Lucas Barry, and Quinton Clark for the presentations. Thank you all.
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine, Lucas.
Great. All right. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that's looking great.
So first of all, hello. I'm Lucas Barry.
And I'm Quinton from Unity. Okay, yeah, I'll start. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the project, and then Lucas will take you through the scheme in a little bit more detail. I was actually going back through my photos to find out when we first visited this site, and it was almost 5 years ago, in the summer of 19. And it's a bit of an odd one for us. It's not the type of building that we usually purchase, but we fell in love with it. I know that's a cliche, but we did. And we saw the potential immediately to do something meaningful in Bethnal Green. It's quite a rare thing, I think, in London now to do something transformational and to be the first of its kind. And I think this little part of London is real London, proper London. And that's kind of what we wanted in a building. And that formed the basis of the brief that we set to Carmody Groarke and the rest of the team. I think there were 3 key elements. The first one being that we wanted to retain as much of the existing building as possible and kind of celebrate the authenticity that it has. But we wanted to balance that with something contemporary and contextual, most importantly, but really, and I suppose bringing to the end of my brief, but to create something that was really fantastic. This is a very dilapidated site, and it was a chance to breathe life into something and create an exemplar of sustainable office development in London, which is something we're very excited about. I make that sound very easy, and here we are almost 5 years on, but we're very excited to show everybody what it will be like when it's finished.
Good. All right. Well, I'll take over the presentation now and just talk you through some of the process that has got us to this point. So firstly, to set the scene, for anyone that doesn't know Bethnal Green, this is Bethnal Green Road. This is a part of East London that has a particular high street that I think will be familiar to lots of people across the UK. There is a certain eclecticism and kind of irregularity about how this street kind of appears, how it's experienced. So we, as Quinton said, we were invited to look at this building in 2019. This is the existing building. This is the site. And I think the first thing to say is there is quite a modesty to this particular building. You can see that this building is basically a ground plus 2 floor warehouse. I think that what's quite particular about this site is that it sits on quite a prominent corner. And as that previous slide shows, a typical high street usually features buildings a bit like the bank on the left-hand side, where they have a certain kind of civic presence. In contrast to that bank, our building is quite utilitarian, and it has very simple ornament, and obviously all of that is kind of derived from its function as a warehouse. And as Quinton said, the very clear motivation of this project was to investigate ways in which this existing building could in some way be utilized or reused to form a new architectural development. So we were very, very clear that we wanted to retain as much as we could and use that as the starting point for something new. As part of that process, we looked obviously a lot at the existing records, and these are drawings that we managed to recover. You can see that the building is 3 floors overall. It's a concrete frame building constructed in the 1970s. You can see between the 2 elevations at the top of the screen there that there is a much longer elevation that has this kind of lateral quality across its length on Hollybush Gardens, and a much shorter elevation on Bethnal Green Road. Internally, I think that the building has this kind of quality that I think you would expect from a 1970s warehouse. First of all, it has these really generous open plan floor plates. This is basically achieved from these 9-meter spanning concrete beams that come across the short section here. But there is also a kind of charm to the kind of rawness that you can see, particularly in these shots. So this is evidence of the existing concrete beam and hollow pot floors that are infilling the concrete main beams. And I think that this is pointing towards the type of space, as you can see on the right-hand side, that is kind of unfussy. It's robust. And obviously in its previous purpose as a warehouse, as a textile warehouse, it supports a certain kind of pattern of use, and we were interested in what further uses we could imagine and kind of extend into its next kind of generation. And I think keeping a lot of that character was very much at the forefront of our mind. I think externally the building contributed quite poorly actually to the street. So Hollybush Gardens on the left-hand side of the screen here is a really characterful street. You can see the cobbles just exposed in the foreground there. The building at ground level was actually much more kind of closed off. So you could see that the ground level on the right-hand side of the screen here was basically promoted lots of antisocial behavior. And we were very much interested in the opportunity that we could grab in contributing better to how this building animated and contributed to its prominent setting on Bethnal Green Road and Hollybush Gardens. And just to locate the site, if you don't know Bethnal Green Road is this kind of primary high street that runs east-west. You've got Bethnal Green Road tube station immediately to the east, a viaduct that runs north-south, and our site is this kind of L-shaped plan. We were quite interested in actually how, looking back at how the streetscape had evolved over time, what this points towards is a very typical evolution of a London high street. So in 1870, you can see lots of fine grain, much more domestic scale plots, and obviously as it developed into the post-war 1970s and 80s, you get these much larger scale commercial light industrial buildings, but still with this kind of sense of the narrow plots, which I think is derived from its original residential evolution. And I think that this was a kind of core part of the architectural response. This is an elevation looking at the site along Bethnal Green Road. And I think the first thing that we noted was that there is no kind of predominant building height. What there is instead is a kind of irregular pattern that kind of gives identity to these buildings through their kind of plot shape. So there is a kind of irregularity to the townscape in this part of London. And some of those buildings actually have quite a interesting and quite kind of proportionally elegant proportion. So a lot of that is, as I said, derived from that kind of plot shape, but you get these buildings that that just appear to spring and kind of jostle for prominence along the high street. And we were quite interested in how that character could be extended further into our design response. So one of the first sketches that we did, I think, if not the first sketch that we did, was very much looking at the proposition of keeping this existing building and using that as a starting point to generate a kind of new architectural form. And as we said at the start, that was we were very determined to keep as much of that as possible. But as the architectural identity developed, we were interested in actually using the kind of springing point of that structure and the window pattern itself to generate and almost kind of make a symmetrical extension. So in doubling the building of 3 new floors over the 3 existing, there is a kind of coherence to the way that the new part of the building has a relationship to its existing part. And we explored that further through models. So this was one of the further developed models that which looked a little bit more about the kind of compositional idea of this building. What I wanted to touch on was, as this building got into a planning phase, there is a very conventional approach to extending buildings, which we were very much pushed towards from some of the voices in the local authority that were expecting a kind of certain kind of deference that you get from the setback, the typical setback that you, I think everyone is probably aware of in kind of urban situations. And instead, we preferred the idea that the rigorous kind of structural logic of the building actually is a really interesting generator of a new form, and perhaps the kind of coherence of new and old together is a more interesting architectural approach, which also works better with the kind of optimum structural approach for the building. And the material quality obviously is key to achieving coherence. So you can see here, these are some of the design renders that we did. The idea of employing a galvanized steel cladding to this new exoskeleton above was very much considered for its, firstly for its kind of robust quality, but secondly, its tonal similarity to the grey brick. As humble as that is, it is a key starting point to thinking about how you compose something new with something existing. And you can see that obviously in its kind of exaggerated form as it moves up, there is a kind of similarity and kind of subtle extension of that language as it is applied to some of those existing windows at the lower levels. There is another purpose to that particular cladding approach. Obviously, in a building that sits kind of in a prominent position facing south and west, we needed quite a strong passive strategy. So the idea here was to use these exoskeleton fins to generate lots of passive shading to obviously reduce the reliance on mechanical cooling, and also to use the window pattern, as you can see, as a kind of continuation from the lower floors to above, as means to naturally ventilate as much as we can those internal workspaces. Again, as I said at the start, that one of the big kind of ambitions in terms of an urban strategy is to better contribute. And you can see here the extension of those openings right to the ground level. This is a shot from Hollybush Gardens showing those new openings, which we think hopefully will make a much better kind of street experience for those using Hollybush Gardens and Bethnal Green Road. So how we came to do this, obviously, a lot of the challenges and approach is driven by a structural concept. So firstly, we work very closely with a design team, including Davies Maguire, the structural engineers. The structural concept, as we moved into the detailed design phase, had to adapt, obviously. This drawing shows the concept, really, of these new floors that you can see are very proportionally similar to the floors below, but subtly just set back from that existing external face, so that the new structure is threaded through that existing structure into and loading into those existing foundations at the bottom of the building. So in a way, there is a kind of very simple structural diagram that you retain as much as you can at ground level in the existing building, and you essentially thread this very delicate, lightweight frame on top of that. Now, the choice of steel was driven by lots of factors. The primary one was the span across the short distance. We very much wanted to have open span space, as the existing building already does, but the steel frame was also a way of just as light as possible surcharging those existing foundations. We found that comparable schemes with things like glulam and structural timber resulted in excessive downstands and actually a much heavier overall structure. And one of the key considerations of all of this was the presence of the central line. As I said, the Bethnal Green tube station is right next door, and we actually have this vent tunnel that runs right underneath the building. So the preference was very much not to disturb any of those existing foundations and to utilize their capacity in the best possible way we could. How that was achieved. So there are lots of, I'll show you some existing, some in progress photographs, but this really demonstrates the way in which some of those structural ideas have been achieved. This is one of the new steel columns that is threaded through the existing concrete beam, which you can see corresponding in the base here. And so the way that those connections are made are quite literally almost a meter long drill holes through each of those bolt marks that basically line up that structure and deliver that weight all the way through the building and then right into the foundations. This is one of the images of the trial pits that we dug out, investigating how deep those ground beams are that span the short distance. So essentially all of that structure is delivered right into the ground, not disturbing anything that is essentially or not adding to any of that existing capacity. So returning again to the kind of compositional idea, as I said before, the building has a kind of very lateral composition on Hollybush Gardens, and we very much wanted to retain that sense through the developed design. And I think a big part of that was the kind of I would say the replication of this kind of window pattern. So whilst the windows are not exactly the same, they share almost the same exact proportion as they do in the existing building to the top section of the existing building. And just to reference one of those typical new floors, it will be quite hard to see on the screen, but you can see the presence of these steel columns that thread through, and the new core, which is the primary core, which we had to rebuild as part of this project, and a new staircase further to the south. The new cores meant that we had to significantly intrude in some parts of the building, although pretty much we left it as it was elsewhere. This was probably the biggest intervention throughout the building to locate that new stair core and lift core. So that was primarily to upgrade the quality of those which were not fit for purpose, but also to give stability to the overall structure. And at the same time, that kind of quite significant intervention was kind of combined with a very thoughtful and careful approach to retaining lots of the character, just revealing the quality of that and using that as the starting point to think about the character within the internal spaces. I'm going to show a couple of videos now that just give you a sense of the atmosphere as the project progressed. There's no sound, just in case you were wondering, but this is just capturing some of the quality of those spaces as we observed the construction progressing. So this was forming one of the new stair cores, and this shows the erection of the steel as it came out of the existing roof level. You can see the presence of the bank towards the right-hand side. I think what's really interesting about this photograph, which is in progress, is it really captures perfectly the kind of interface between the existing floor at the lower level, which is essentially the floor of the second floor. This is actually the middle one is the roof level, the existing roof level, which we are taking out to install a kind of hybrid technique of the concrete beams in addition to timber joists. So there's a kind of hybrid interface between the existing and the new. And then finally, the brand new structure. So at the top here, you can see that the steel threads through those those concrete beams and then meets this new lightweight structure with all of the timber secondary structure revealed. And I think another part of this is you can see very much the ambition to keep this kind of proportional language of those windows, that lateral quality from the existing to the proposed. This is just a snapshot of one of those new spaces that we're creating, very much in progress. Firstly, I think that you can see the quality that is made from just letting that existing structure be revealed and be maintained as one of the kind of generating characters of these new spaces, and the quality of light that you get from this kind of almost wraparound kind of 360 glazing. The timber the timber infills have been a really lovely addition to the kind of character of these spaces. These timber infill, they're essentially logs. These are Douglas fir. They are solid logs, 200 by 200. They are purposefully intentionally left exposed as one of the kind of generating characters of that space, and we like to think of that as like a kind of contemporary warehouse quality, very much mimicking that rawness below, but obviously in a contemporary way. And how that looks, and one of the floors, again, not quite finished, but you can definitely get a sense of the quality of space. And then just to remind everyone of the quality that we were very much interested in replicating, toggling between those two, you can see that the proportions are still the same. Obviously, the quality of light increases as the building grows from the ground, but very much interested in kind of leaving as much of that structure exposed as we can and generating really good quality workspace. The galvanized steel cladding is obviously a critical part of the scheme, and I think pulls together the kind of tonal material quality of the building. This is something that we've explored in kind of research and development terms of other projects. But I think what we know from that process is you very much have to be present in the kind of industrial formation of how these things come together. So we went to visit many galvanizing plants. This particular one was in Wolverhampton, and we observed the cladding and tested many different ways in which that cladding could be achieved. Now, this is showing the 3 mil thick steel plate being dipped and retrieved from the molten zinc bath. So what that results in is this incredible kind of metallic quality, which fuses the zinc to the host metal in a really interesting way. And what we particularly like about that is that there is an imperfection and an irregularity to the way that the metal reacts, to the steel reacts to the zinc, which has a certain patina, which we think really felt appropriate to the place, to Bethnal Green, but also gave the building a kind of certain identity, which would mellow over time. So as you can see, the figure of some of these panels which form the cladding, very kind of figured, but actually that kind of dulls down as the metal oxidizes. Some of the details of how that comes together. So that's a rain screen cladding. It's essentially fixed back to the steel structure through a secondary grid. I could speak a lot about the differences in tolerance between the steel, the concrete, and the cladding, but as you can probably imagine, they are not the same. So there's a lot of kind of tolerance that you have to build into the design to achieve these kind of interfaces of new and old. This drawing, I think, is particularly interesting. It captures the kind of vertical slice through the existing building, particularly in the lower levels down here, and then the mid-level that you can see is the residual part of the parapet detail, the new hybrid timber floor, and then the new kind of warehouse, steel warehouse that sits above. Those all kind of work in kind of in a kind of vertical slice that, as I said, delivers all of the load back to those existing foundations. But you can see there is a kind of correlance to the external fins, which all meet in the same datum line, giving the building a much more kind of harmonious quality overall. And this is just really a sneak peek of as the building is being unwrapped at the moment. It will be complete in probably the next month or so, but you can see the quality of that kind of three-dimensional cladding as it sits just on top of the brickwork. And again, the brickwork being exposed, that will receive a color. It's been kind of essentially washed with a kind of slurry, but that will all come together I think, as the design is intended. The last point I wanted to talk about was just really a snapshot of a kind of environmental metric. So what we've done as part of a kind of retrospective look at this project so far is understand where we've come from. Firstly, the measure of the upfront embodied carbon in tons. So we've measured that through the Revit model and managed to work out around 150 tons of embodied carbon in the existing structure. And we've done a kind of like-for-like comparison. So with the new, with the existing and the new combined, and comparing that to, let's say, a brand new build of the same quantity and quality, we can be sure at this point that we are definitely saving around 140, potentially even 150 tons of carbon from the idea of retrofit as opposed to new build. So I think it does point in the right direction. Probably a better metric of that is how we look at embodied carbon in kilograms per meter squared. And again, this is a work in progress, but it very much points towards a really good comparison to some of those kind of key benchmarks, LETI 2030 and the RIBA 2030 guidelines in terms of embodied carbon per square meter. So again, I think that is very pleasing to see, and I think that certainly endorses that intuition that it was the right thing to retain at the start. What have we learned? I think that's a really good question, and I'm sure everyone will have lots of questions, but a building like this does not have, there is no regularity, and there are certainly lots of unknowns. And I think that the way in which we approach the architectural idea is a very clear approach, but one that needed to have an improvised approach and inbuilt tolerance. And I think that works on the basis of letting that building tell you what it needs to do and building those tolerances into the certain technologies. The other side of it, I think, which is quite interesting, is thinking a little bit more about the disassembly of those elements. So anything that you're adding new, that in that future generation, If for whatever reason the building needed to be disassembled or adapted again, it could be very easily, because everything that we put in is essentially in component parts. So some interesting takeaways. And again, just wanted to finish up by saying that this project was a completely collaborative process. I can't name everyone working on the project at the moment, but there is a whole host of people that have been involved throughout this collaborative process. So thank you to everyone that's been involved, and we should be able to take some questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Lucas. Really great to see all the work in progress and get that kind of sneak preview of it. So that's amazing. So just a reminder to attendees in the webinar, if you would like to put your questions to Lucas and Quintin together or either of them individually, please do use the Q&A chat function. You can type those in and then I'll address them to both of our speakers and presenters today. So to kick off that conversation, Lucas, Quintin, I was curious about planning. You did touch upon it a little bit, saying in typical planning terms, they might have asked you to put the new extension back a little, but you wanted to keep with that identity of the warehouse structure and follow through. I wondered if you could together say a little bit about how that went.
Yes, talk about the pain of planning.
Or some of the lessons learned for, continuing projects of this nature into the future.
Absolutely. I think we, as Lucas said in the beginning, we were very much encouraged to follow a much more classical way of extending this building. But I think we really believed in the Carmody Groarke kind of approach to the 3-on-3, and that ended up leading us down a much longer path from a planning point of view. We were refused, and we could have kind of scaled it back and done something that would have been a lot easier. But I think we think this is the right approach, and we think this is the right thing for Bethnal Green Road. And so we sort of supported that, and we took it to appeal, and we won unanimously. So I think what we've ended up with is absolutely the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was, Quintin alluded to, it was there was some opposition in the approach here. I think that we felt a strong conviction that this was the right approach for this building, and particularly the right approach for Bethnal Green Road. We wanted to give this building a new lease of life. We wanted to retain as much as we could, and all of those ingredients comes together in the way that the building appears now, which is, I think it all takes its clues from that existing building. And we very much, I think we set a bit of context, which was that this building is kind of, in a way, a bit of a prototype for how we're going to have to consider buildings like this in the future as well. So not just Bethnal Green Road, but probably many high streets have these quite modest, slightly peculiar buildings that don't look like banks or post offices as they did in the Victorian times. But nonetheless, there is a kind of utility there. And particularly in the proportion of this building, as you saw from the internal spaces, the ground floor has a really nice floor to ceiling height. And we said, well, most of what you would want from new building is pretty much already there in the first place. Then it's about investigating ways in which you can use that as a starting point to kind of derive a new architecture. Yeah. We certainly went against the grain in terms of the convention of the kind of deferential quality to a kind of an extension to an existing building. But we very much argued that there was a kind of engineering kind of rationale to that as well, which very much followed the existing building. So I think that that the building in its kind of frame and its quality kind of led us in that way. And we said, well, actually, the conviction of all of those coming together, and what we felt was a kind of very eclectic townscape. We think, well, I mean, it certainly won over in the appeal, but I think that it points towards a kind of mindset that I think is changing. This was 2019-20, so obviously I think that the imperative of keeping and retaining and retrofit is much more central to the dialogue in planning now. So I would like to think that the next time something like this comes along, I think that there might be a bit more open-mindedness to how it might be conceived.
No, that's great. It was a tricky question, so great answer.
Yeah.
And I know you're not ready to obviously show people around or welcome tenants in, Quintin, but it's looking like it's going to achieve what you set out to kind of retain that sort of warehouse sort of style space and identity. So well done to both of you. So questions from attendees. We've got a great question in from Emily, thanking you for the talk. Is the building completely passive in its operational energy approach? If not, how is heating/cooling going to be incorporated?
Well, first answer to that is it's not entirely passively operated, although it can be. We've designed it so that it can operate on a very low setting, if that makes sense, in terms of its usability. But of course, there will be moments where extreme heat or extreme cooling, extreme heat or extreme cold may be needed to a mechanical system might be needed to supplement that. So it's being designed so that tenants can plug into the building. There is an MVHR on each floor, and there is capacity that we built into the external east side for tenants to upgrade as they wish. But as I said earlier, we very much we have prioritized decreasing as much as we can the reliance on mechanical. It obviously needs to be designed so that it can operate in a kind of dual function. So I would like to think that for most of the year it can operate entirely passively.
Yeah, I mean, principally it's a naturally ventilated building, isn't it? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Question from Alex Swain. Such a great story of the design development. Will that story be presented to users of the building, potentially at the entrance? A community in Bethnal Green would appreciate to learn about the textile factory past and how you've shaped the new scheme.
Well, absolutely. We are super open to what we do with the building at the ground floor. We have quite a good dialogue with a lot of the local residents and artists, and I think we're already talking to various people around how we can, because the ground floor of this building was always very, very closed off. And as Lucas said earlier, we're opening up every single bay, if you like. So the intention is that this becomes, a big part of that sort of local community. And for sure, absolutely, yeah, in the ground floor, we're really up for something like that.
Right. Is there a brand for the building yet, Quintin? Have you got
I think we have I mean, you can see the name there, Galvanize, but I think we hope that it sort of speaks for itself. We're not heavily branding it.
Okay.
And I think maybe that's the architect in us, but no, it's I'm hoping it sort of speaks for itself in the end.
Right. No, such an asset for the area. Brilliant. Okay, structural question in from Noel Kirby. Can you tell us something more about the new and the existing structural interfaces and how they work? Are the new steel columns at lower level braced by the existing concrete structure? And then the next bit of the question, and how was fire protection addressed?
I knew that question was going to come up.
Always.
I might flip back to a photograph, which I think really perfectly encapsulates that that question. There we go. So the existing and the new. So as I said before, the steel columns sit essentially snugly between the existing concrete beams. There is a kind of there's a flat panel that essentially is that interface. They are as close as we could get in tolerance terms to essentially fitting perfectly between the existing and the existing slabs and the downstand beams. So those are placed in between and then essentially threaded through. Now there is I'll just go back to a photograph of that. So there is, if I flip between the two, you can see that the top of these bolts, which are visible, and then the top section, which shows you kind of roughly what that looks like after it's been achieved. They are not bracing the structure, they're essentially passing the load through the concrete. So obviously, we are essentially making a hybrid structure. We're dispersing that structure obviously in a direct way through the structure, but we are not having to brace it. So the essentially most of, if not all of, the structural frame of the building is retained bar the area of the lift shaft. The final point on the fire, so all of the soffit of the new floors is treated with a fire retardant, and the logs, the Douglas fir, which obviously are timber, those have been oversized to deal with the charring fire performance. So those are deliberately much bigger than they need to be, and we're able to leave those exposed because of the fire strategy of the building. It is quite a compact floor plate, so we're able to have those two escape routes and therefore able to expose the timber throughout the building.
Great. Thank you for the answer and the question as well. So moving on, a question in from Janice, and this one's about embodied carbon. So were there any major compromises made, for example, in your concept or building materials in order to achieve the embodied carbon count that you did? Or was that continually informed along the way with a low number in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I can say one very particular decision that was made on site that was, with embodied carbon in mind was the avoidance of building a very large tower crane crane base. So one of a typical way in which you would obviously place a tower crane is delivering that through the lift shaft and on top of basically a sacrificial huge tomb of solid concrete. And instead of that, we worked out a logistic strategy along with the contractor to use a kind of locally supported spider crane, which basically utilized a scaffolding structure threaded through the building to basically avoid having to pump in, I think it was something like a 6 by 3 meter pad of mass concrete to found a crane. So we obviously improvised in that sense and used smaller, we kind of designed the stairs in a way that I think was a slight compromise from the design, but it basically meant that the stairs moving from a precast concrete to a steel stair was in a way of avoiding the need for a much larger crane capacity. So again, very much focusing on how we can just take those kind of marginal gains and avoid any kind of unnecessary use of high carbon solutions.
Thank you. We've got 2 final questions. Hopefully we've got time to squeeze them in. So the first from Evan, who was actually a structural engineer working on the project.
Hi, Evan.
You've made friends again. So the question specifically is around how did you satisfy TfL regarding access to their ventilation shaft during construction? And I thought my question was tricky, but this one, and how did the uncertainty? Oh, sorry.
Everyone knows that is a very thorny subject. I'll let Quinton answer that one.
Pass it on.
So how did we satisfy them? So we ended up, and Lucas has not mentioned it yet, but we've ended up cantilevering the whole back portion of the building over the TfL vent shaft to ensure that we do not impede upon them. So what should have been quite a straightforward column support system ended up being a very complicated cantilevered solution. So that is how we appeased them in the end.
Great. Good cantilevered solution. Amazing. Okay. A sneaky extra questions popped in. I appreciate if people have to leave, do so, because we did advertise we'd finish at 1:45 and it is now 1:45. But if you can stay, Next question, have you incorporated any energy generation strategies? For example, is there a green roof?
Well, there is a partial green roof, and there is also a solar panel array on the roof. I'll see if I can get to. There is a kind of. See if we can get to that. There was a drawing. I'm not going to try and get to it, but yes, we are generating electricity through the roof, and that was, even though the site is completely constrained on 4 sides, we've managed to really maximize that expansive roof area to generate as much energy as we possibly can. There is a small amount of green roof to the rear of that, but yeah, we've prioritized energy generation as much as we possibly can.
Amazing. And then this little extra one, very refreshing to see an office space not reliant on raised floors, but how are services distributed? And that will be our final question to you both.
Well, it's quite simple, really, because the building is relatively narrow. It's kind of 9 meters across. We've prioritized services basically running in the perimeter walls at low level. That's the primary distribution of things like small power and data. But we've also managed to just sneak in floor boxes. So we've managed to really get those floor plates as low as we possibly can, or as skinny as we possibly can. But we have managed to sneak in 1 or 2 floor boxes for the distribution of power. So if any tenant needed to, they could extend partitions. We would hope not, but you could do, and you have very short distances to run, because obviously the building is already quite narrow. So we thought, let's prioritize the head height rather than lots of expensive service runs.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for those questions, and thank you Lucas and Quentin for presenting and answering those. So really appreciate you taking the time today to speak. Yes, and as I said at the beginning, we do have more events in the Retrofit 24 programme. So if you do want to join us again, please check out our website. And Lucas, I know there's an essay on the Carmody Groarke's website, isn't there, about this project? So
there is, yes.
Yeah, so if people want to find out more, feel free to visit and read through that. And this event has been recorded and will be on the Building Centre's YouTube channel in a week or 2. And if you want to watch back or share it with colleagues, feel free to do that. We kind of appreciate any support in spreading the message about great reuse and retrofit projects. So thank you everyone, and bye from the Building Centre and bye from our speakers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.